While the world struggles with the pandemic, it only adds to the problems many countries are facing, and Iraq is no different. Before the first trace of COVID-19 hit, Iraq was dealing with the effects of the 2003 invasion, corruption, financial mismanagement, tensions between the US and Iran, and widespread protests. We sat down with Minister Ali Allawi in Baghdad. As Iraq's first post-Saddam defense minister and later finance minister, he has been deeply involved with all of these issues. He serves again now as Iraq's finance minister and deputy prime minister. This is not your first time serving in the Iraqi government. In 2003, you were Minister of Trade and Minister of Defense. Back then, you were grappling with sectarian violence that nearly brought the country to the edge of civil war. What are the challenges you're facing today?
Well, we have some challenges at all levels in the government. I mean, we have a security challenge, which is less, I must admit, than it was 15 years ago, and certainly much less than in the days of Daesh. We have an economic and financial crisis of the first order. We have a collapse in oil prices. We have, of course, the coronavirus pandemic. We have also issues of large youth unemployment, control of borders. So multiple crises really that are facing the country, but not one of them has reached a point where you can say that it has the same dramatic effect as the war against Daesh or the beginning of the sectarian civil war in 2005. So in many ways, the problems are more in terms of their number, and their complexity is also greater. And it requires, I think, a great deal of effort and systematic coordination to tackle them so that not one of them grows into becoming what I would call an existential problem.
Shortly after you took office, you announced plans to diversify Iraq's economy, wean the country off its reliance on oil sales. This has been the cornerstone of your reform plan. How do you begin to implement economic reforms, attract foreign investment, encourage local entrepreneurship in such conditions?
Well, it's extremely difficult to do so. I mean, it's like learning to fly a plane while you're in the pilot's seat. We have to make certain fundamental changes in the structure of the economy, the sources of revenue, the relationship between the government and the private sector. All of that is now extremely lopsided. And until and unless we do that, any attempt to talk about reforming the economy becomes really impractical. So we have to look at the underlying causes why we have inherited this kind of structure and what we must do about it. Because if we continue along this line, it's very, very difficult to see how we can have sustained economic growth and job opportunities created for our youth. So we have to tackle the problem at its root. And at its root is a fundamental distortion in the Iraqi economy that has been going on now for nearly 4 decades. And in the last 18 years since the fall of the former regime, it's been compounded by poor administration, poor strategies, economic strategies, poor policies, and of course the continuous issue of maladministration and corruption, which has affected the way in which decisions are made and the way in which resources are allocated.
The protesters appear to agree with your plans to reform the economy. But how do you reform the economy such that young people are more excited about private sector jobs than working for the government?
Well, the government has been the first and most desirable source of employment because it offers all kinds of perks that are not offered in the private sector. First of all, the salary levels are quite high, the benefits are high, and the most important thing for young people, for some reason, is the fact that they might get a pension at the end of 20 or 30 years of service. So the incentives to work in the government is really extremely large and makes the private sector non-competitive. So the youth and nearly everybody else gravitates towards finding jobs in the government because it gives them a sense of security. As a result, we have a huge public sector, some payroll, that now exceeds nearly 6 million people. in a population of around 40 million. So it's massively bloated. And most of the demands now by demonstrators and so on is to get jobs in the public sector because of the incentives to work in the public sector. But the other side of the coin is that we have extremely poor productivity, and the output of the public sector is really very, very poor given the resources committed to it. And this situation cannot be sustained for much longer. So we need to tackle this. It's one of the root issues of the problems in Iraq, is that the revenue is based on oil. Oil is subject to all kinds of amplifications and ups and downs. And we have the issue of cutbacks to meet the OPEC quotas. So our revenue base is severely constrained, while our cost base for payrolls and so on is at an extremely high level, leading to deficits that are very difficult to finance within the fiscal constraints, the tax constraints that we have.
Walk us through some of the highlights of your reform program, and how soon before there are tangible results? Has the pandemic slowed down your timelines?
Well, the pandemic obviously creates another issue for us, because apart from the issue of public health and so on, we have the issue of how it affects the economy, and an economy that is already extremely fragile. So it's affecting the employment rate, it's affecting the work in the informal sector. Nearly 70% of economic activity in Iraq outside of the public sector is in the informal sector. And if you have lockdowns and travel bans and so on, it creates a very unfavorable environment for people to earn a living. So the mix of issues that we face right now makes it problematic to introduce a radical economic reform plan and expect very quick results. So I think that within a 2 to 3 year horizon, the effects of these reforms, if they're maintained and sustained by subsequent governments, would have, I think, a strong effect in changing the axis of the Iraqi economy. I think beyond that, what we need to do is to create the new basis for economic activity that would then be the platform upon which economic growth can be based. And I think to do that, we need a 2 to 3 year time frame before these reforms set in and take on a permanent feature.
Well, back in June, you said that the country was facing an existential economic situation, and that if problems were not fixed by the end of next year, there would be problems you wouldn't be able to fix ever. Is this still the case, and how has the pandemic affected the timeline to achieve this program?
Well, I don't sound alarmist, but if you keep on deflecting, and if you keep on postponing the need to make reforms, the problems just accumulate. We have around us some countries that have faced economic ruin because of their unwillingness or inability to undertake reforms. Lebanon is a case in point. We're not in the same situation as Lebanon, obviously, because we have at least one very large source of foreign exchange earnings. But the way that we employ this, the way that we allocate resources from this single revenue source, which accounts for something like 93% of the budget, is extremely significant. And if this revenue source begins to and is being affected by fluctuations, we have a fluctuating revenue source meeting a very rigid expense issue, mainly payrolls. It's like a sort of irresistible force meeting an immovable object. And as a result, we have deficits that keep on growing. We have sufficient foreign exchange now to be able to manage that. And there is, I think, debt capacity in the economy to borrow domestically and also internationally. But at some point, this is going to reach, again, a plateau. So unless we change the structural nature of the Iraqi budget, it's extremely difficult to see how we can continuously make up for these deficits without running the risk of either serious inflation or drawing down dangerously our foreign exchange reserves. So from a macroeconomic point of view, it is really significant that we undertake these reforms as soon as possible, primarily looking at the various aspects of the expenditure lines and trying to diversify, not easy, but trying to diversify revenue sources in the short term.
Attracting foreign capital, foreign investors are key to your reforms. Setting security concerns aside, how do you go about reducing the significant bureaucratic impediments that usually put people off from doing business in Iraq?
Well, we have to tackle them head on. There's just no other way around it. We have to remove all the massive red tape that exists. A lot of it is due not because of bureaucratic resistance to foreign investment, although that exists, but because there's a whole layer of laws and regulations and so on that make it extremely difficult to conduct business in this country smoothly and without enormous bureaucratic roadblocks. So these have to be tackled. These have to be removed. We have to change our laws and regulations. The National Investment Commission has to be more proactive. In order for us to create an environment that attracts international investors, there has to be also a recognition that investors come to make a return, and that return has to be reasonable. So far, the returns on investments in Iraq, given these hurdles and issues, is not particularly high, not only for foreign investors, but also for Iraqis, which means that we must create a new institutional framework for it, reforming the bureaucracy that handles companies and businesses and the economy, reforming the legal system, reforming the judiciary. All of these things are necessary to create an environment, improving the banking system, which is also problematic here, creating an environment that would attract and maintain a high degree of investment in this country.
Can you speak to the programs being discussed with the World Bank and the IMF? How much hope do you have in these institutions?
Well, the IMF, as you know, helps when it comes to short-term budgetary issues, foreign exchange crises, international indebtedness and so on. We are in constant discussions with them. We may find that we probably need a kind of what is known as an SBA, a standby arrangement, that would allow us to draw on support from the IMF, not for just financial reasons, which may not be necessary, but really to create the reform structure to allow us to undertake the necessary reforms supported by international agencies. The World Bank is different. I mean, the World Bank is prepared to support us from a budgetary point of view, but they're more important in terms of project finance and project development. And we're working on them to maintain the level of public investments in areas that have high social impact. So we're working with the World Bank to create a series of large-scale projects with a large social component to take the edge off the issues that we might face from reducing the budgetary expenditures and from the issues that we have of unemployment and so on. So the programs of the World Bank are mainly, or will mainly focus on the mobilizing the social aspect and improving the income of the poorest paid in this country, or the poor generally.
The mass protests appear to have abated, but the problems remain. Mass unemployment, corruption, power cuts in the midst of the summer heat. What are the measures that have to be taken to start resolving these issues and address the concerns of the protesters?
Well, it's really to do with maintaining an effective and efficient government. The fact that the power sector does not supply electricity is not because there wasn't enough money thrown at it. We've had tens of, maybe up to $100 billion thrown at the power sector. But it's the way that this money is utilized, the technology is used, the way it's administered, the whole institutional structure of that sector does not deliver the goods. So you have an input of a certain amount of money, you expect certain outcomes, but they don't happen because of the poor transmission mechanisms. And this is affecting the way, not only services in terms of electricity and power, but also in water, in terms of education, health, across the board. The performance of the Iraqi government is extremely poor by international standards. And if we don't increase the effectiveness and efficiency of government, we will not be able to provide services, which means that a lot of these services can also be provided by the private sector, but which they have, for example, in the power sector. There are a number of large IPPs, independent power producers, coming up. But they only respond to market incentives, and if the pricing is right, then they will invest. So we're now looking very carefully as to how we can move large sectors of what were before in the purview of the government, moving them onto the private sector. And we hope that a more focused, more productive, more efficient provision of these services through private operators would remove some of these issues, bottlenecks and so on. Of course, you can't do that on every sector, but where it's clear that you can have power, definitely, water, perhaps, educational services, certainly, and so on down the line. But they of course dovetail into the issue of having the proper environment to attract and maintain this kind of investment. So all of these issues are interlocking with each other. What the demonstrators want, above all, I think, is a responsible, efficient, and accountable government. And they also want jobs. They're two different issues. Jobs used to be provided by the public sector until about a few years ago. We just cannot afford to continuously give jobs to people who are unemployed. They just join the government payroll, receive a salary, and don't show up or work very little. Their productivity is extremely low, and it's basically condemning them to a life of really dead-end jobs. If I was a young person, of course I would try to look for financial security, but at the same time I want to see where this thing is going to end up. I don't think there's much work prospects in a government office that's bloated and has 10 times more people than it needs. So we have to address these problems. There's a whole, as I said, an intricate web of interlocking issues that cannot be disentangled overnight. We need patience, and we need the support of our people to be able to do that.
What would you tell these protesters if you met one of them? What would you give him what word of advice would you give them?
Well, the usual, I don't want to give them platitudes, go and get a job in the private sector, because it doesn't exist. All I can tell them is that we're all in the same boat together, and we have to create the environment to lift this country out of its conundrum. It's no different. What would you tell a person coming out of the rubble of Europe in 1946? We need to get to work to change the environment of this country. We can't just expect the government to resolve these issues, given that the government has only one single source of revenue, which is extremely fragile. So, of course, a young person will feel somehow left out because they're not part of this equation. But this is reality, and I would like them to share in the problems. Now, there's a lot of programs that we're thinking of doing, and we will do, public works programs and so on, that would soak up a lot of this unemployment. And I hope they will not be dead-end jobs, so that there will be jobs that would have some kind of prospects in future, jobs with some training, some kind of uplift in their skills and so on. We're now putting these two together, a bit of patience. The government will continue to maintain some kind of basic safety net when it comes to social security and to the food basket. But we need time to provide good, meaningful, relatively well-paying jobs. And for that, the people have to accept that we are in this mess because of very poor administration and mismanagement over the last, I think, several decades, but accentuated in the last 18 years.
In the past few months, you have been on official visits to Saudi Arabia and Iran. A delicate balance between two regional powers fighting for influence in your country. What was the outcome of these meetings?
The outcome, I think we have to insist that this country is independent, that this country is sovereign, that this country formulates its foreign policy on the basis of its interests. We want to also reduce, perhaps we can't eliminate in the short term, direct foreign interference in our political process. This is something that exists, which is undeniable. It's a process of clawing back, I think, our sovereignty and our ability to take decisions autonomously. And that requires time. This country has been a playground for foreign powers for a very long time, ever since the disastrous policies of the former regime. It opened up the country to foreign interference. Now, to extract ourselves from that requires, I think, not only will on our part, but also a willingness on the other parties to accept that this country cannot and will not continue as a battleground for foreign interests here, even though some of them are neighbors and friendly. So it's a question of clawing back. It's a question of political culture. It's a question of cutting the links between our political class and its reliance on foreign patrons. This will take time.
In 2007, you wrote an article for The Independent in which you outlined a blueprint for peace in Iraq. You advocated for devolution or decentralization and called for a regional economic and financial integration plan. Do you still stand by this prescription for Iraq's ailments?
I think not only do I stand by it, I think it's become essential for our survival and for the region. The region has been torn apart, and it's no different really from Europe after World War II. It's been torn apart by internal struggles and by foreign powers playing around, and by admittedly extremely cynical political class that has destroyed the integrity of several countries. Now, this can only be done, I think, there has to be internal reform through devolution of power, which means that we may have to restructure the power relationships in this country in a fundamentally different way within the geostrategic unit that is called Iraq. But Iraq is not an island upon itself. It has to be linked to other countries here. And the only way for this whole region to move is to create much closer links between the various units here. So a larger economic sphere that would include most of the countries of the Middle East, the Arab countries of the Middle East, together with perhaps the two major non-Arab regional powers, as a kind of new order for the Middle East, I think is absolutely essential. And that would have to start with economic relationships and integration at various levels, transport, perhaps energy, perhaps having uniform, at some point in the future, some kind of currency arrangements. All of that, I think, removing trade barriers, removing the barriers of people moving around. There's a great deal of commonality in these countries. And if you look at it as a kind of one economic region without frontiers or borders, you can see how each one complements the other. Politics intrudes, but I don't think they're insurmountable. So at the local level, at the domestic level, we have to devolve power. We have to create new relationships between the units, the provincial units, even the region with the center. And at the regional level, the Middle Eastern level, or West Asia level, we have to think outside of the box. And we have to start the process of some form of economic integration that begins to gradually, by creating mutualities of interest, gradually remove the barriers of mistrust and lack of confidence. And then in time, looking down 10, 20 years down the line, I think young people will see that there is a far better future when they have a much larger canvas in which to live and work. And I think there's just no other way. We have nearly all the states that emerged from the post-Ottoman world are in a terrible situation now. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why is Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and what was then, Palestine, has been decimated in this way? And looking at the problems, you find a lot of them are really to do with this disintegration of bonds and ties that made the area quite a viable and economically vibrant area. And also there was some high degree of social and political stability, at least at the local level. We just have to recreate the circumstances for that. There's a lot of commonalities that can be used to build a new order in the Middle East.
Is this similar to an EU model?
Well, the EU, yes. EU obviously has its own history and its own trajectory. But it could be, ASEAN is another model like that, where post-conflict societies got together and transcended their problems. It requires leadership, it requires a vision, and it requires a will. The resources, I think, will be found, so it's not a question. People always look at the money side first. The money side only is important after you've sorted out all the other issues. So I think we'll be pushed into that direction sooner rather than later.
Final question. You are an engineer, you're an investment banker, and an Iraqi historian with a wide view of Iraq's history. To paraphrase Charles Dickens, Are these the best of times or the worst of times for Iraq?
Well, they're neither the best of times because we've had better times, neither they are the worst of times because we've had worse times. And since you use Dickens as an example, Dickens also wrote a book called Great Expectations, which is what I hope for this country, is that my expectations for it are great and positive. They are difficult times, they are trying times, and they can become the worst of times, but they can also become the best of times. As things stand right now, I think we're at the crossroads. The decisions that we make in the next few months, perhaps a year, are going to be central to whether we go towards great expectations or towards bleak house, but I prefer great expectations.
Dr. Ali Allawi, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.